So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all the speakers and delegates who've joined this RW Roundtable on role of utilities in EV charging. This is part of a webinar series called RW Roundtable on EV charging, and we started with the first one on potential of battery swapping, and the second one was on EV supply equipment. This is the third one, and the last one that we're planning is on charging networks and interoperability. The reason why we're doing this particular webinar is that the role of utilities is critical in the growth of EV charging landscape. And we are providing we want to provide an understanding of the opportunities and challenges that face the utilities and also the stakeholders that work with them. So we hope that this will provide a platform for useful exchange of information on strategies that can be adopted by utilities to drive the adoption of EV stations in India. Like I said, throughout the event, I would request the delegates to keep posting their comments or questions or remarks in the Q&A box or the chat box so that the speakers could answer them. And I will now introduce the panelists that we have today. We have with us Ms. Chaitanya Kanuri from World Resources Institute, Mr. D.V. Ramakrishna Kumar from TSREDCO, and Mr. Somesh Kumar from EY India. So Ms. Kanuri is Senior Program Manager, Electric Mobility, World Resources Institute. She leads various research and project initiatives on electric mobility at the national and state levels. She co-authored an NITI Aayog handbook on charging infrastructure implementation as well. She also oversees government partnerships in 6 Indian states to support the implementation of EV demand creation and infrastructure development measures. Prior to joining WRI India, she worked with Sustainable Development Solutions Network as part of their Sustainable Cities team. She holds a master's in urban policy and governance from Sciences Po, Paris, and a bachelor's in architecture from VNIT Nagpur. Mr. D.V. Ramakrishna Kumar is project director, TSREDCO, Government of Telangana. He actually looks after the projects in business development and electric vehicles for the state of Telangana at Telangana State Renewable Energy Development Corporation Limited. He is responsible for expanding solar energy usage through ground-mounted rooftop and floating solar projects and preparation of detailed project report of the projects and installation of EV charging stations in the state of Telangana. Finally, we have Mr. Somesh Kumar, who is partner and leader, Power and Utilities, EY India. He has 20 years of experience of working in power and utility sector, and currently he leads the Power and Utilities practice at EY India. He has rich experience in advising policymakers, financial institutions, governments, and private sector in the areas of business strategy, investment options, policies and regulations, market research, performance improvement, digital enablement, and other service areas, along with developing thought leadership in power and utility sector. He's an active speaker at various conferences on disruptions in the sector and how developers or utilities should deal with them. He's a chartered accountant by profession. Great. With that, I will request Mr. Kumar, if you could begin your presentation. Since you're a co-host, you already might be having the sharing rights.
Yeah, thank you, Kushbu, and very good afternoon to everybody. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to be at this panel and with my esteemed fellow panelists. So just to set the context, I just have a brief presentation, so I will just project that. Please let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. You know, as we all know, electric mobility is the future. So there is no doubt about that. We are all transitioning towards that in different, you know, sort of time frames and different pace. But we all know that that is the ultimate goal that we have to achieve, where, you know, electric vehicles have to be the dominant mobility sources in the country. So as a result of that, you know, what is the role of the utilities? What is the role of the electric utility, you know, in enabling this electric mobility transition? So I'll just briefly talk about that. I don't have too many slides, just 4 or 5. So first of all, you know, EV growth would really augment electricity marginally. However, it will require upgrading grid hosting capacity and related planning. So this is just an illustrative example where, you know, we are showing that as a result of EVs coming in and, you know, also, you know, increasing at a steady pace, EV charging may lead to complicated demand forecasting because of the variable nature of the demand which may come in. And we don't have a time frame for charging of EVs. It is intermittent charging. As a result, we can see that the transformers could be underloaded, overloaded, and there could be a differential transformer heat maps for electric utilities. So this is just a graphical representation for everybody. The next one, I would just like to highlight that utilities, sometimes are not able to make good of the developments that are happening. But through electric mobility, I think utilities are uniquely placed to actually devise or provide charging services while generating a reliable and high potential revenue stream. So what all can the utilities do? How can the utilities actually contribute towards e-mobility? So this can be really a new source of revenue from, utilization or monetizing of their land and their assets. There is clearly no upfront or no major upfront investment which is needed for setting up of charging infrastructure. There are no regulatory or major regulatory approvals needed. The utilities can also look at minimizing or reducing their losses through the additional revenue that comes up. And definitely, it results in a brand recognition for contributing towards clean or climate change goals and scaling up of EV ecosystem. So these are some of the, monetary and non-monetary benefits which utilities can derive. As charge point operators, the benefits are, if they tie up with the utility, the benefits are that they get access to required assets for setting up of charging station quite directly. It's easier for them to get necessary approval from the utility also, and they can also partner with utilities, thereby increasing their recognition. So it's a sort of a win-win situation where the charge point operators collaborate with the utilities. So both will tend to benefit. And then there are a host of stakeholders around that, whether government or industry association or financial institutions or, EPC players, also, standards and, service providers, etc. So, just on what are the roles which the utilities can play, towards EV charging infrastructure. One is clearly an electricity retailer. That's the easiest. They can continue to supply electricity on a retail basis at prescribed EV tariffs, EV charging tariffs. They can also develop and forward integrate to become the charge point operators themselves. It requires certain investments in charging equipment, but it can also result in higher margins for them and a steady revenue stream. They can also become a real estate partner for charge point operators by providing their land, the land which has not been used around substations or other facilities. That can again become a standard revenue sharing arrangement between the service provider and the utility in the manner provided by the MOP. They can also become the demand aggregators for EV fleets for various government departments. Certain utilities have already started doing that. And lastly, they can also look at the role of a financier. Although, there is a caveat there that a lot of utilities are not, financially very strong. So, this still remains a topic of discussion. But there are certain utilities in the country which can look at this. And on the right hand side, I've just given a few examples of a few utilities which are taking up EV charging infrastructure in a big way, whether it is BSES or Karnataka, Kerala, or Maharashtra and Discoms. So all of them are progressing, I would say, at a decent pace towards setting up charging stations. Earlier, or even in some cases now, these have been on pilot basis, but now we see more and more scaling up happening. Also, improving the EV charging business, utilities will require additional revenue drivers in the form of some focus incentives and other business facilities. So we have looked at the cash flows for utilities, and based on a sort of a not optimistic, but a base case kind of scenario. We've seen that it may take some time for the utility to pay back the revenues, probably 10 years. So if there is an intervention in form of certain incentives, etc., this may further accelerate, or it may happen faster. Particularly because capex is not allowed as part of the revenue requirement which the regulator allows to the utilities, although 2/3 of the revenue has to be shared back. So it is very important that the business of service providing for charging infrastructure is completely separated from the otherwise electricity supply business of the utilities. It's very important. Otherwise, the revenue that they make will be shared back without the capital expenditure being allowed. So, this is something which needs to be considered. And lastly, some of the issues that, of course, we have seen and which may become more prominent, and we have also seen some of these issues coming up in certain other territories where electric mobility has taken up in a bigger way. So EV charging may cause grid overloading during peak hours and will also require network augmentation in certain cases. Then depending on the location, certain feeders may become disproportionately loaded and thereby creating challenges in load balancing. So there may be need for shifting loads from one transformer to the other. Then setting up EV charging station is surely a capital intensive business, which will require financial aid and support for upstream infrastructure. And also, according to MOP guidelines, EV tariff should be less than or equal to average cost of supply, which may not be entirely viable right now. But further recommendations of waiving demand charges for CPOs may affect economics of distribution utilities. So I think these are some of the challenges which we are seeing, and which this team panel can throw more light on. There are also opportunities for utilities in terms of vehicle to grid integration. That's like the backward integration, and also supporting through destination charging and home charging, or also prescribing time of day tariffs to manage the peak loads. So I think these are just some of the ideas, just to kickstart the discussion. And I would just stop at that and pass on to Khushbu.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Kumar, for that very excellent presentation and for setting the context of the entire discussion. So I'll now move to Ms. Kanuri. Ms. Kanuri, if we could just, get a sense of, what is your take on the role of utilities in the EV charging space? Just brief remarks from your end. And maybe you could also talk about what sort of studies does WRI does on that.
Sure. Thanks, Khushbu. First of all, I think Mr. Kumar has covered quite well what the potential roles of the utility could be. Of course, some of these are more core functions of the utility than others. For example, many utilities are looking at the opportunity of charge point operations in this sector. But at the same time, utilities are compelled to provide the electrical connections for sure. And at the same time, they also need to ensure that there is some return on these electrical connections, because if they keep providing electrical connections and they find that there is actually not much charging demand there, then they're not earning revenues either. So if there are a lot of charge point connections that are required by charge point operators, I think this might be an additional challenge that I'd like to submit as well, that we've heard from certain utilities, that as they're in their core role as electricity supplier, they are finding that the return on electricity connections provided to charge point operators sometimes are lower than the usual other more reliable electricity supply connections that they actually have to serve. So yes, the role is evolving, and yes, they're going to need to figure out how to remain sort of afloat and profitable. I mean, not profitable, but at least break even in this space. But one thing that is very important and that they need to look at is the role of planner, right? Utilities anyway act as planners for the distribution network. They do their annual revenue requirements on a regular basis. They understand what are the peak load requirements so that they can arrange their power purchase agreements as well accordingly. They're constantly estimating how much upgradation will be required of the grid on a year-on-year basis. And with the arrival of EV loads, all of these requirements are going to change. And they're going to change fairly significantly, especially at the local level. So there is, Mr. Kumar's presentation mentioned very rightly that EV growth will augment electricity demand only marginally. And that's correct. At the national level, if you look at it, EV charging loads, I believe, are expected to be somewhere about 3% of the total electricity demand of the country by 2030. And that's marginal, right? That's not an issue. But we do know also that, and Mr. Kumar's presentation also pointed that out, that at the local level, this is going to be much more variable. You're going to have much higher requirements. And there is one study that was done by IIT Kanpur 2-3 years ago, which tries to understand the different scenarios for EV charging at a city level. And what they find is how EV charging loads will impact the load requirements in cities is the peak will shift. So if the peak for a city, say, is arriving at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. regularly, this might move to 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. because EV charging peaks at that time. And it will increase significantly. So it's, and it will increase significantly and faster than the regular electricity demand is increasing. So all our cities are consuming more and more electricity every year. But charging loads are going to grow faster than regular electricity demand is going to grow. So we are finding that based on this, these estimates, we find that by 2030, the peak electricity demand in any of the top metropolitan cities may actually grow more than 100%. So it will double. So how do distribution utilities plan for that and actually start preparing for it accordingly? I'll stop here for now.
All right. All right. Thanks. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, if we could come to you now, sir. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Good afternoon, sir.
Good
Sir, since you come from a state body, so maybe you could give us some state-related perspective on how can utilities actually enable EV charging, and what is your state particularly doing in this space?
Yeah. To our understanding, the charging infrastructure planning is the most crucial thing in addressing the range anxiety, and a lot of study has to go into this from the utility point of view, from the city planning point of view, from the traffic point of view, and the key areas where we can plan for this kind of charging infra. And my state, Telangana government, with the support of WRI and all, we have done a meticulous planning about how we can able to strategically locate these charging stations. And we have currently about 156 charging stations in Hyderabad, and we are ramping them to around 990 charging stations, out of which 90 odd or will be the freshly upcoming the fast chargers, apart from the 118 charging stations sanctioned to Hyderabad. The rest are all the charge points. Like these are all like kind of pole mount chargers where two-wheeler people can easily charge their vehicles, because we understand that two-wheelers are going to be a game changer in the EV adoption, and they are going to be, and even the Niti Aayog and Government of India is clearly emphasizing every time whenever there is a space that the adoption by 2030, what they are projecting majorly is the two-wheeler, three-wheeler adoption. Four-wheelers and the buses will be morely focused on the fleet managements rather than the personal segment. But the two-wheeler and three-wheelers are the major game changers in this adoption process. So that's why, keeping that in our view, we have already identified the locations about 1,000 plus in Hyderabad city, and another 500 to 600 on the highways and the other second at tier 2 cities we have focusing right now. So we have already signed the MOUs with the oil companies, utilities, discoms, and the urban local bodies, wherein there is a potential possibility of having a charging stations in the locations that are available. And we are in constant discussions with the discoms about the issues that are being faced by these CPOs in terms of the voltage and in terms of all these things. So our discoms are already geared up for the potential opportunity that is going to come for them in the EV space, and they are consistently updating about their networks in this regard. So right now, at this point of time, planning is what is more important from our understanding. So we have been working on that with various stakeholders, public and private side. So to focus that on this thing. So from the state side also, one is from the infrastructure side, we are putting a lot of focus, but on the other side, we are giving the equal importance on the awareness also and promotion also. So the adoption we have planned starting with the government agencies. So by now only we have already issued the required guidelines to all the departments through a zero process for allocating the locations. Second one is adapting them. Their existing government fleet should be adapted to at least 20 to 25% on a voluntary basis. Is what one thing we are trying to focus. So this is how my state is progressing right now in the EV adoption space.
Right. Mr. Kumar, Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, if I can ask you, you mentioned 990 charging stations. Is there a time period for installing these?
Actually, out of that 990, the fast chargers, which are going to be around 100 or so, 90 or 100, will be coming in the next 3 months. We have already started the construction process. The charger will be ready by another 1 month or so. The electricity connection and everything will be taken up by a 2 to 3 months plan. But the charge points, what I'm talking of, the AC chargers 001, which is going to be pole mounted, it will be taking little time, about 4 to 5 months, because a lot of approvals will be there, traffic approval, urban local body approval, discom approval, everything will have to be in place. So that will take little time, about 5 to 6 months. But I'm not saying the work will start after 5 to 6 months. The work will be completed within 5 to 6 months for the AC chargers.
Right. And was there any, extensive bidding process done to empanel these CPOs, or,
Yes.
know?
We have called for an empanelment tender.
Okay.
We have empaneled around 18 charge point operators, and we have even called for a procurement tenders. So here TSREDCO also will be acting like a charge point operator in some areas where there is a less demand, where CPOs are not in a position to come there. So there we will be focusing to see that the infrastructure is given there slowly.
Right. Thank you. With that, I'll move to Mr. Somesh Kumar now. Mr. Kumar, looking at the overview, overall power distribution sector and the state that it is in right now, except, 2 or 3 utilities that have actually done some work in this space, what is your sense of, how much time will it take for the other utilities or the state discoms to actually accept EV charging as one of the things that they can do? And how does this compare with what's happening globally in markets like Europe and North America, where utilities are actually doing a lot in this space?
So, actually, as EY, we've been working with different states in helping them accelerate their setting up of charging infrastructure. So we are also working with the nodal department, that's BEE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, at the central level, which is sort of, helping states take up charging infrastructure. So yes, what we notice or observe is definitely that, there are different utilities or different states are at different stages of their journey. So some states have, surely taken up the charging infrastructure and setting up the charge points in a much bigger way, and some are, just starting. and some are in between. So on an overall basis, I would say that, we see a fairly good response from almost every state. I mean, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that this is the future and this is where we have to transition to. Of course, the issues remain, the issues that we talked about, as Ms. Kanuri said, about the return model, about looking at what happens to the demand scenario and how to manage that, and how to manage the variability, etc. So all those issues are there, but the states are coming up, and I would say that by 2030, I see a significant shift happening, in terms of setting up electric charging infrastructure. Obviously the question is, do the electric vehicles come first, or does the charging infrastructure come first? So, my belief, and, belief for some other people, has also been that the charging infrastructure should be there, and the vehicles will follow, which is the trend I think we saw in other countries also, just to respond to what you said. So, there are certain countries or geographies which have some kind of a body set up to actually facilitate or promote or accelerate setting up of charging infrastructure, or there are some dedicated programs, like, for instance, in Delhi itself we have Go Electric. Similarly, in UK and some other places, we've seen certain concerted efforts being made. So I think each state is moving up in that direction, of course, at a differential pace. But I see a substantial progress happening by 2030. So I would stop at that. Yeah.
Ms. Kanuri, would you like to add something to that here?
I did want to add something to that. Thank you. So in terms of, so just to add to what Mr. Kumar was saying, I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the programs that are being done by utilities abroad, and a couple of the leading utilities in India as well. So there are two types of programs I'd like to speak about. The first is the programs that are providing financial support for upstream infrastructure, as well as for chargers. Now, under FAME 2 as well, we have support for charging infrastructure, but the FAME 2 program right now does not provide financial support or incentives for upstream infrastructure. And this is one thing that I think we could learn from the different programs that are being run in the US and UK and EU as well. Some notable programs, and these are usually federally funded, so funded by the central government, given that many of our discoms are cash strapped and are not able to fund some of these programs. That might be a useful initiative in India as well, where a certain part of the financial support for both the upstream infrastructure and the charger are provided to the charging operator or to the landowner. And thereby, if it's given to the landowner collaborates with the charge point operator, thereby the land access also opens up and we're not dependent just on public land. And there are targets. So different districts, different counties, different regions have a different amount of funding allocated to it. And they have to provide certain plans in order to access this funding. So there are federally funded programs that support upstream infrastructure. That is one. And these are also targeted for residential charging. There are several targeted programs for residential charging, which is another thing that is currently not there yet in India. At the moment, most of the public funding support is being provided for public charging infrastructure, which is well and good, as it should be. But at the same time, given that there are so many existing buildings, and like Mr. Kumar was saying, especially in these residential buildings, especially for private EVs, if the infrastructure is not there, people find it incredibly difficult to get an EV. It becomes a fight for them with their own society, with all the lack of knowledge, awareness, and capacity. And so if there are programs that actually have, create a stock of residential EV charging points, that we believe will be a major accelerator for EV uptake. The other innovative program that utilities are looking at, and that actually has revenue potential, is a bundling of services. So say you're providing a financial incentive for a residential charger through some federal program or some incentive, and say that like Telangana has done, you empanel a bunch of charge point operators, and as the utility, you become the single point of contact to actually provide the incentive, the charger, and the electricity connection, especially for private individuals and home-based charging and building-based charging. This ensures a couple of things. One is, by bundling all of these services, the utility becomes an intermediary that can also become a part of the charging business chain. And secondly, you're also ensuring the safety of the electrical connections that are going to be coming up for EV chargers. I think we've seen some news from China where a lot of residential charging has been leading to hazards because of, and because they're at a higher scale right now, and it's a good lesson for us to learn, where they're thinking of actually banning residential charging because it's leading to so many issues. So if the utility sort of becomes the holder of these connections by incentivizing them for users and by earning a profit and by ensuring safety, it becomes a win-win-win sort of a program as well that could be emulated.
Right. I'll take that question now to Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, since you did say that you are sort of examining both the models where you're also acting as a CPU in some areas and also carrying out procurement programs. So purely in terms of commercial viability, is it better for a state agency to work as a CPU, or is it more commercially viable for them to take on empanelment or procurement programs? Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, are you there? All right. I think he's facing some connection issues. Sarthak, could you please check with him once? I'll move to Mr. Somesh Kumar till then. Mr. Somesh Kumar, are you there? Yeah, thank you. So I'll take this question to you now. In terms of purely, commercial viability, what makes better sense for an Indian utility, a state discom right now, especially looking at their revenues, etc., for them to, sort of take up demand aggregation and behave as a CPU, or for them to, just carry out procurement or empanelment related programs?
Yeah, I think, the latter, which is just to do empanelment and get vendors or third parties to do this work, is easier for them. But personally, I would subscribe to the model where, they actually forward integrate and become the charge point operators, because, see, the whole landscape for utilities is changing. The distribution companies are no longer monopolies of providing power. So, you see distributed generation happening. You see, rooftop generation happening. You see consumers moving away. So, utilities have to evolve newer models for revenue generation. And this is clearly a very, very good model where utilities can, forward integrate. This is something which is very natural to them. They have all the infrastructure available to make electricity available. They just have to add it up with the charging infrastructure. So I think I would go by the first option, that utilities should integrate and become the charge point operators also for their commercial sense as well.
Mr. Kumar, just to your point, I mean, and I'm sure you might also agree on this, is I agree. I think that does become a useful revenue stream. But at the same time, we're finding that a lot of PSU-led charging operators are struggling in terms of revenues. And this is partially because we need a lot of partnerships in order to make charging lucrative. We need to be actively scouting for those partnerships with fleet operators and with various others. So while I completely agree with you that I think it's an excellent alternate revenue stream going forward, what you originally also said, that it needs to be kept as a completely separate corporation that has its own specialization in charging and that is actually actively scouting rather than it becoming part of this large public service corporation would be essential, because charging requires a lot of work and is a completely different business to be viable, and very few charge point operators are currently achieving viability, and And that, that requires a lot of active strategies for them as well. I believe you might agree on that.
No, I totally agree on that. It's not something which utilities have done till now. So it's not some sort of a natural extension of the function that they've been performing. So clearly they will have to evolve the way they've been working. They have to clearly get the new skill sets or business models there, and be ready to meet those challenges. And I mean, your point is absolutely right that if we, I mean, for instance, one utility will work only in one geographical area. So, it can supply or become the charge point operator. Say if it is Telangana, it can be only in Telangana, or even in Telangana, there could be different utilities. Whereas the charge point operators could operate, across the country, across different states. So they may have better wherewithal to actually have a better business model and take the risks that, which you are, or evolve the ecosystem, what you're mentioning. So, I mean, there are pros and cons for both, but it is definitely something which the utilities, I feel, should try, because it can definitely add as a revenue stream. But I totally agree, it's not as easy as said. They would really need to work upon that in a big way.
So both of you did speak about some, incentives that can be given to utilities, or in some way that they can be incentivized to, take up such EV charging programs. Can we list down just maybe top 2 or 3 sort of incentive programs that can be designed specifically for, promoting this for utilities? Mr. Kumar, if you could begin with you, and then we'll ask Ms. Kanuri for the same.
Yeah, so I think Ms. Kanuri spoke about the FAME 2 scheme, so that's already there. It does not provide a full range of financial incentives. So that is one thing which could be extended to even the part of the infrastructure which is not covered as of now. Also, in terms of some of the taxes and duties, I think we have seen could be rationalized a little bit more for a certain period of time. Even under the PLI scheme, we can look at certain incentives being extended further. I mean, there for battery in any case, but for other EV charging components also possibly there could be certain kinds of incentives given. So although I firmly believe that, these incentives are just to kickstart and, provide the momentum, but, they cannot last forever. So, the industry has to become self-sustaining on its own. So probably as long as, as Ms. Kanuri said, that probably, it's not lucrative enough, or, you don't see that much revenue coming in, probably you can have certain incentives set up, but ultimately you have to plan for a full-scale commercial viability of the whole setup. But yeah, these are a few incentives which could be considered, in my view, for immediate term, I would say.
Right. Ms. Kanuri, your thoughts, top 2, 3 suggestions that you have.
So, I mean, if a utility is operating as a charge point operator, it's the same sort of incentives or support that any charge point operator might require, right? And one that is being discussed a lot right now, and that is already in operation in many places, is the revenue sharing arrangement for land. Urban land being very expensive, especially urban land in high demand areas where charging demand is likely to be higher because there's a greater concentration of vehicles there. So land parcels there are going to be very expensive. And so the Ministry of Power has also, in its latest guidelines in January 2022, provided this recommendation and guideline to states that public land be aggregated and public land parcels be aggregated and provided through a revenue sharing arrangement, where in lieu of land rental, a revenue share of up to 1 rupee per kilowatt hour or another amount per kilowatt hour of power sold for charging services is provided to the landowner. What this does is it allows charging operators to, of course, reduce their operational expenditures and pay as per however much they are earning. And that helps, supports the business grow in the short run, in the long run. And the other thing which could be considered again is the support for upstream charging infrastructure. Now, having again looked at some of the business viability analyses of the charging infrastructure ecosystem, it's also important to say that that's not a huge component. if you're looking at a service period of 10 years, it's actually really the operational costs that stack up and rack up. It's not the capex can be sort of equalized over a 10-year period, for example. It doesn't become a big component of the expenditures. But nevertheless, given that it is a big stumbling block, and given that utilities, I mean, there are some regulatory constraints, but utilities could technically absorb these into their operating costs for the upstream infrastructure when they're setting up charging. So that could give them a significant advantage, in fact, if some regulatory amendments were made that enable them to actually take the distribution infrastructure for EV charging into their own operating costs. So yeah, those are a few thoughts there. I mean, none of them are foolproof, honestly. They would all need to be thought out a lot more, but if we're sort of brainstorming, yeah, these are some potential avenues that could be explored.
Right. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, are you back, sir?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So I had asked you a question that, in terms of commercial viability, since you're operating as both a CPO and also as someone who is procuring EV charging stations. So in terms of purely commercial viability, what do you think is a better business model for a state utility?
See, this is not the time initially to look about the commercial. That's the reason why the DHI and Niti Aayog has entrusted this responsibility to the public utilities and public sector undertakings in the initial phase. So initially, to address the issues pertaining to the range anxiety, the charging solutions are the only options. So governments better understand this, and they does not look into the commercial aspects of it. They'll install it. Slowly, what will happen? This gives the confidence. Example, today when you buy any IC vehicle, what is the least preferred thing that you look for? It is the capacity of your fuel tank. You don't even bother to ask them. So, because the IC engine business has evolved already, the electric mobility business is evolving slowly. So that is the reason why today we are finding infrastructure for the electric vehicle charging station is a first priority. But once the business is evolved, this is the last thing that everybody will talk. So initially, commercial viability of this is not a goal for Telangana. We wanted to ensure that wherever there is a potential possibility and a nice place for installing the charging stations, we are going and installing it. Today, the occupancy rate, if you look at other than Hyderabad, is less than 1% or slightly 1% around. But for whereas in Hyderabad, if you see, except few locations, rest are all there also it is 1%, but except few locations it is up to 4%. It is going on the charging demand wise.
Right. And so follow-up question to you is that, we had 2 more webinars on EV charging. One was on battery swapping and one was on EV supply equipment, where we had a lot of CPOs who took part. And for, from all the CPOs, the major concern was, number 1, land allotment for EV charging. And number 2 was, connectivity and delay in connectivity from Discoms, especially for captive charging. So how is, can you give us some suggestions that you are implementing in your program, which could be helpful for, other utilities on how to go about this?
Actually, as far as the locations are concerned, in Telangana state, we adapted a simple procedure. We have given a GO from the government order to all the public sector departments, whether it is state or even a little bit of central also, which is falling in this vicinity, that the locations that are found suitable for the charging infrastructure, and if those locations are not utilized by those departments, has to be given to TSREDCO. That is my department. Then in turn, what will happen? My department will sign a contract with those landowning agency for revenue share, and we will allot these locations to the empaneled CPOs, and they will be responsible for payment of that land revenue share and do it. So like that, we have got somewhere around 1,000 locations right now in and around of Hyderabad. That is the way we are going forward. And there are few private parties also who are showing interest to give their locations to us. So these locations will be again given to these charge point operators for installation of the charging stations.
Right. All right. I'll take some audience questions now, and if time permits, I'll ask a few more of my own questions. So the first question is from Prateek Bhandari, and any of the panelists could take this question. He says it's a slightly unrelated question, but if somebody could answer it. So EVs directly use electricity for charging. Hydrogen cars, on the other hand, require electricity to be first converted to hydrogen and then used in car. Is there any need for hydrogen cars then? Won't the cost of fuel always be more expensive than directly using electricity to charge? He's basically wants to know, the viability of hydrogen versus EV charging. Would anyone like to take this question?
Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Today, we are talking EV because the fuel rates have gone high. But if you see about 100 years old back, electric vehicle has been discussed during those times only. Maybe, but the battle has been lost to IC vehicles because that time the fuel cost was very low as compared to the cost of electricity to bring in. I'm talking of the not the cars and all, but at least the this one and everything. Slowly the process has been evolved. Today we are talking of hydrogen, which is costlier affair. But going forward, when India starts the ambitious hydrogen policy and the production of hydrogen, probably hydrogen will be an alternative solution for the fuels today what we are talking of. But at this point of time, electric mobility is found to be cheaper option against IC or even the hydrogen point of view.
Right. Mr. Somesh Kumar, would you like to add something to that? I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, just wanted to add actually on the hydrogen cars, even for the electric cars as of now, we see that they're costlier and the offtake is, still picking up. And, there is some sort of subsidy provided for that. So, hydrogen cars are still much more costlier. So I think till the time the viability is there, we may actually not see those coming up. I mean, although conceptually we're talking about those. But definitely they will come up only when things start becoming a little more viable. So as and when hydrogen become more viable and the cars become more viable, then as Mr. Ramakrishna said that then the whole setup may be viable and it may be ready. So this may not look very viable or ready right now, but in times to come, both the running cost of hydrogen as well as the cost of hydrogen cars may become quite affordable, but I guess that's still some time away.
Right. And the next question is from Ms. Neerja Agarwal. That, what is the difference between fast chargers in terms of volts and time taken to charge? Ms. Kanuri, would you like to take that question?
Sure. First of all, when we say fast chargers, it's a bit of a misnomer, right? Because a fast charger for a two-wheeler is not a fast charger for a car. So generally, when we talk about fast charging, we're talking about DC charging, which does not require you to go through the onboard charger. So AC charging is where alternate current is passed through the charger to the onboard charger, where it is converted to direct current and then supplied to the battery. So the capacity of the onboard charger becomes a bottleneck. Whereas direct current charging, which is what fast charging is generally known as, is goes directly to the battery. And so the battery's ability to absorb power, which is generally called the C rate, the charge rate, is what limits the speed at which a battery is charged. So if we are talking about fast chargers, they have a range of power ratings. The power ratings might range from 5 kVA, kilowatts, or kilovolt amperes, which is what I believe the approximate size of what the Aether grid, which is the fast charger for either two-wheelers, has about a 5 kilowatt power rating. Whereas the highest power ratings potentially available in the market right now in India are maybe around 150, 200. Globally, they go up to I think even 350 to 400 kilowatts. So e-buses, for example, may have a battery of 150 to 200 kilowatts. And if you have a 150 kilowatt charger for an e-bus, that will still take an hour plus to charge. That is assuming that the battery has a 1C rate, which is technical, but that's okay. At the same time, that same 150 kilowatt charger might charge a car in 15 minutes because a car battery is only 50 kilowatts. So if it is capable of drawing power at that speed, it can be charged much faster because it is a much higher power, smaller battery. So essentially, I think at the end of the day, to provide a straight answer, the power ratings for fast chargers range from 5 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. It's a huge range. And the speed at which a vehicle is charged will depend on the size of the battery and the size of the power rating of the charger. So it depends.
Right. And there were a couple of questions from Ms. Sahana L. So I believe Mr. Somesh Kumar graciously answered one of her questions, but I'll move to the other two. One is specifically for Telangana. So Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, if you could answer that. In Telangana, has the amendment been made to the state's building bylaws to install EV chargers in existing buildings and new constructions, both residential and commercial?
Yes, we have made the amendments to the building bylaws, but we have limited it to only the commercial segment, not to the residential. It has certain issues, but in residential segment, we have, I think we have made some suitable changes in which 25% of their parking lots should come on to electric mobility side. But commercials, we have linked it to the building permissions.
All right. And so in residential, does it only limit to, standalone residences, or are these
Group
societies?
Societies and group housings,
okay,
they have to allow, this has been already made as suitable provisions in the Act, but we are not enforcing them at this point of time. But for the commercial spaces, yes, we are doing it.
Right. And Mr. Somesh Kumar, maybe you can take the next question, which is, it's a pretty detailed question, but I'll read it out. EV chargers are intended to function for at least next 8 to 10 years. Presently, the chargers being deployed in cities are mostly taking into consideration the present stock of EVs in the city. In this scenario, how do we plan EV charging infrastructure such that it can serve the growing number of EVs for at least next 10 years? And which type of chargers should be primarily installed in public locations so that they could cater to the larger variety of EVs? Mr. Somesh Kumar, would you like to take up that question? It's a pretty detailed question, but I think you can see it on your screen as well.
Yeah, I'm not a technical expert though, but anyway, I think, the chargers, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, the chargers where we are installing can serve for a longer period of time. So 8 to 10 years should be possible. But I would like to stop at that, and if any of the other panelists would like to add to that, it would be good.
Yeah. Ms. Kanuri or Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, would you like to take up that question on planning of EV charging infrastructure for cities? How is that done?
I think Chaitanya, you can better answer this.
Thanks, Mr. Ram. Thanks, Mr. Ramakrishna. Yes, I can take a stab at this. So I'm just reading the question again. How do we plan EV charging infrastructure? So Sahana, I mean, I'm guessing like we're all going through this. We're all trying to figure this out, right? But there are certain studies that are looking at what the probable size of battery growth is going forward. That say that, the two-wheeler batteries, which are currently around 3 kilowatt hour capacity, may go up to 6 or 7. won't really be likely to go beyond that in the next 8 to 10 years, right? Also, the energy consumption will become more efficient so that, for a lower amount of power, a larger distance will be traveled. So there are certain studies that are looking at these sort of trends to understand what the potential size of batteries will be in the next 8 to 10 years. And what and one key factor that's been limiting 2- and 3-wheelers to AC charging has been the fact that most 2- and 3-wheeler batteries do not have BMS, do not have any sort of liquid cooling. They're air cooled. So this leads to, so fast charging generates higher heat. And so, of course, if you're going to be fast charging your 2-wheeler and 3-wheeler batteries, you're going to need better designed batteries, which are naturally more expensive. So until those developments come in terms of regulations for 2-wheeler and 3-wheeler batteries, you're going to be limited to AC charging. Now, there's also new standards that have come in from BIS, which look at light EV charging for AC and DC types of charging. So the charger stocks so if you're looking at 2- and 3-wheeler charging, that does need to be treated separately. And of course, we're looking at maybe 7 to 15 kilowatt chargers for those. Even if we're looking at 8 to 10 years. And also given that charger life is generally considered to be around 8 to 10 years, and that's probably one tender cycle as well, I believe something around 7 to 15, even if we're sort of future proofing it for 2- and 3-wheelers, and something between, I mean, of course, above 50 kilowatts, but maybe up to 100 kilowatts for 4-wheelers could be the right scale and capacity. Of course, this needs to be figured out and studied, but for the next 8 to 10 years, we will need to provide infrastructure today. So we will have to take some educated guesses and provide that, and have robust tender contracts where you say upgrade as needed, where that upgradation onus is sort of put onto the charge point operators, because we do know that technology might change. And so we need sort of future-proof infrastructure that can grow with the requirements. So that's one other thing. As contracts become more important, these safeguards need to be built in so that your infrastructure doesn't become aged and obsolete.
Right. Right. And Ms. Kanuri, there's a question from one of my colleagues in my team, actually, that, they want to know that which states have the most conducive policies in your experience?
I'm going to say Telangana, because we work with Telangana and we know how much they're doing on this front. Another state definitely is Delhi as well, in terms of they have put into effect the first tender that for public charging, and they've also put in place utility programs as well for actually bundling and providing charging infrastructure, and they also have a residential charging incentive. So a few of those aspects where Delhi is concerned are very progressive. In Telangana, I believe TSREDCO has been doing a lot to look at the business potential, the EV charging infrastructure database creation, and as well as land aggregation to actually bring about the necessary changes to have the growth of charging infrastructure networks. So, and this is also limited by the states that I work with, because a lot of states have a lot of things in their policies, but how well they are being implemented can only be seen when you're sort of up close and personal.
Right, definitely. I think we have one more question from Mr. Ranjit Singh, who is asking that, we're in acute shortage in terms of electricity supply to consumers during 6 to 7 months in India. How would the supply-demand balance will meet the charging station requirements? And at the same time, we are going to take those supply for charging from conventional coal plants or the renewables. I think he just wants to know that, how do we meet the demand supply gap? And also, is this power going to be based on coal or greener sources? If anyone would like to take a shot at this. Mr. Kumar, probably would you like to?
Yeah, so, definitely right now there is no segregation in terms of the power which the utility is supplying for charging between thermal or renewable. So, but the view is that there is no point in actually going on supplying power which is thermal or coal based for EV charging. I mean, it's just replacing electricity from a polluted source from oil. I mean, from oil to electricity from a more polluting source. So ultimately, we have to move to more renewable sources, and the utilities have to find a way of doing that. But right now, all the power is sort of bundled. So I think that's not what is happening currently. So as we move along, probably the differentiation will happen between the power sources, whether renewable or coal-based. Also, the second part of the question is around demand and supply. So I think this is not just limited to the electric charging infrastructure. I mean, the intention is to supply 24/7 power to all the consumers. In that direction, this is just one more potential source of, or just one more potential usage of power. Gradually, I think once we are increasing demand supply to meet the demand in the state, so that would also get covered. And as I said earlier, also there is huge disruption happening. So there is more and more distributed generation happening. We are seeing consumers move away, and we will see more consumers. Commercial, industrial, residential, all kinds of consumers will move away to their own rooftop solars, for instance, or so, they will no longer be dependent on the utility. So in fact, they will probably be supplying back to the grid, which may start happening. So, from that perspective, the whole demand supply scenario will undergo change. It is not that, the power will be supplied only from large bulky power plants. They will be generated from each house probably. So there we will increasingly see the demand and supply gap to be reduced more and more. And I think in that direction, even electricity, EVs will sort of come in as one usage. Definitely, one needs to forecast what will be the utility electric vehicle usage going forward. How much will it increase the demand, and then the utilities have to plan for catering that demand. So like the tie-up right now for supplying to the consumer, they have to also tie up for this additional load. So that will happen. So I mean, in India, we always think that things will work out. Things are happening. Everything will sort of work together in tandem, and things will work out. So I think that's the only thing which I can add here.
Right. And Mr. Kumar, you in your presentation, you did speak about vehicle to grid sort of integrations. Are there any examples that you or any of the other panelists could talk about where that has actually happened? And is that a commercial reality at the moment, or a technical reality at the moment, a vehicle to grid sort of an integration?
Yeah, I think we are, I mean, just my view, I think we are still at a pretty nascent stage. So a full technical or commercial viability of that has not happened. I mean, it is more conceptual in nature. But we have studied certain examples in Sweden, Norway, etc., where, in some cities, this grid is happening to some extent. So, vehicles are being used as potential sources of storing electricity and supplying back to the grid during their peak hour requirements. But largely it still remains a concept, and studies are on for that. I think we have not reached that level of demand or a critical mass where this could be experimented on a bigger way. So it still is some time away, I guess.
Right. Ms. Kanuri, you were adding, I think, about to add something to that.
I was just going to add on the renewable energy aspect of, powering electric vehicles with renewable energy. There are a couple of trends, there are a couple of use cases, right? At the current time, e-buses seem to be the ones that are closest to exploring how to quickly integrate site-generated renewable power because e-bus depots and all have larger rooftop areas. And so they become good use cases where locally generated renewable power can be pushed back into the system for charging the e-buses that are coming up. That's number one. It also reduces the load on the grid, like Mr. Somesh Kumar said. The other thing that's going to be required if you're going to be looking at site-generated renewable is battery energy storage systems. Otherwise, you'll be limited to charging during the hours of renewable power generation, which is during sunlight hours typically, because we don't have local, we don't have too many local wind systems. So battery energy storage is also now tied to EVs, because the second life use case for EV batteries becomes stationary storage. So EV batteries, if they reach about, the typical wisdom is that if they reach about 70% of their usable capacity due to degradation, they can no longer be used in the EV use case. But at that time, they can be refurbished and used in the battery energy storage use case, which is likely to reduce the cost of stationary storage, which becomes more scalable and thereby allows more renewable, locally generated renewable power to be used for powering electric vehicles. The third thing, and this maybe Mr. Ramakrishna also is going to be able to speak to this, is just in June, there has been a change to the open access rules. Open access basically regulates which consumers are able to demand to select their power provider. Typically, as an individual retail consumer, you get your power from your local discom. But if you are a large consumer, and in the past, this large consumer was defined as anyone who had 1 megawatt of storage power requirement. They can then select either the serving discom or another power provider to provide them power. And the other power provider could be a renewable energy power provider. Now, in early June, the open access rules were amended such that the be able to use open access and get a different power provider was reduced to 100 kilowatts. 100 kilowatts is 2 fast chargers, 2 fast car chargers, 250 kilowatt chargers. So now actually any charging station could actually use open access to get renewable power supplied for their particular charging operations. And this can be a big game changer in increasing the stock of renewable power that is actually powering the transport sector.
Right. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, are you planning renewable energy integration in any way in the EV charging stations that are being planned in Telangana?
See, actually, my department is a nodal agency even for the renewable energy promotion also.
Right.
So it will be always there for in every kind of activity that we take it further, whether it is the EV charging stations or whether it is the household or anything, we promote renewable energy. So definitely for the EV also, we will be doing it. And even the Ministry of Power himself has told that there should be a 30% of the renewable energy power that should be coming into this EV. But today at this point of time, if we enforce that mechanism, there are certain limitations, whether it is the open access mechanisms or because the settlement code that will happen under open access mechanism at this point of time will not suit for the EV charging stations because of their occupancy, which is being very low. So what will happen at a later date when the maturity comes in the business, then automatically renewable energy will becoming a major source of energy for them to the cost of power in terms of charging.
Right. And before we actually close this webinar, I would like to go to each of the panelists one by one and ask them if they would like to add anything or give their remarks or just 2 minutes brief remarks from each of the panelists. I'll start with Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar this time. If you could switch on your audio, sir. Video. Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, are you there?
Yes, I am there. Yes.
Yes, if you could just switch on your video, and I would also request Mr. Somesh Kumar to please switch on his video so that my colleagues could just click a quick picture for LinkedIn. Yeah, and Mr. Kumar, your closing thoughts.
No, you are asking me.
Yes, I'm asking you, sir. Okay. I'll start with you this time. Yeah.
Okay. See, definitely these kind of webinars do really should happen. And because of which, what will happen? We will be able to think out of box thinking while implementing certain plans for the state. See, even as Kanuri was mentioning that Telangana is one of the state which we have come up with in a major way as far as the policy is concerned, but we are always in a consistent phase of updating the policy initiatives which we have given. At the point of time when we have issued the policy, our thought process must have been something else, assumption. Maybe practically that may not be giving the end result at this point of time. So we are geared up to change those kind of policies and would like to adapt and amend the suitable policy changes initiatives that is required for a state in terms of promoting the electric vehicle as a major this thing in this Telangana. So that is how, and the initiatives like we wanted to give the electric two-wheelers to all the government employees on a soft-term loans and something like this is what we have already started it. So to make such kind of initiatives, what are all is required from the government point of view, we have done it. So slowly now, these kind of webinars will really help us in understanding what is happening across the globe and how this is going further. How can we address certain issues if somebody is facing it? So all these things will come to our thought process, and we will be able to take a proper call on that.
Right. Ms. Kanuri, your closing thoughts.
Thanks. So I'll maybe just highlight the 2 or 3 things that I think are important for the ecosystem to focus on right now when it comes to charging. When it comes to public charging, I think the main challenges right now remain the land and electricity access. That is what is slowing down the implementation of FAME 2 as well, where a lot of funding and subsidies have been allocated, but the charges are coming online much slower than expected. And that is for public charging. The other thing is that really needs to be sorted out on a priority basis is residential charging. That is crucial for the uptake of personal electric vehicles, which are, and given that personal vehicles are growing at such a tremendous rate, this becomes a very important inflection point where you start moving that motorization to electric, and the sooner you do it, the more like millions of vehicles you can actually convert faster. So thanks.
Mr. Somesh Kumar, your closing remarks.
Yeah, I just have one small point. We see different states at different stages of evolution of this journey. So some states have a policy, some states still don't have a policy, some states have a policy but are not implemented fully. So as Ms. Kanuri had said earlier, the proof lies in the extent to which you have implemented the policy. It's not just about having a policy. Possibly, Government of India or Niti Aayog or some other body can actually come up with a electric mobility implementation index kind of thing, which actually measures the implementation which is happening in the different states, the stage of evolution they are in. So that would probably give a better idea and impetus to states to sort of compete and put this forward also. So, probably some kind of a benchmark across different states, or a, relative index which can tell them where they are and what they need to do. So, that just as a thought.
Right. Thank you. And on that note, I will close this webinar, and I would like to extend a huge thanks to all the panelists, Ms. Kanuri, Mr. Ramakrishna Kumar, and Mr. Somesh Kumar for agreeing to be part of this panel discussion. And I would also like to thank all the delegates for taking time out for the roundtable today and making this a very interesting discussion. Just a small note from my end that our next roundtable on charging networks and interoperability is on August 2. And for the people who are attending this event, we will be automatically sending you the login link for that one, so you need not register again. And we do hope to see you at our next roundtable. Thank you so much.